GhastlyGarlic Episode 51. Ghostly Lovers. Shadows of a Doomed Romance. Chapter 1. The First Encounter. Claire had always known that hospitals were places where life and death coexisted in a fragile balance. As a nurse, she had witnessed her fair share of tragedies, miracles, and everything in between. But nothing had prepared her for the peculiar events that began one chilly autumn evening. It was a quiet night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, an old and sprawling facility in a small town in the UK. The hospital had a reputation for being haunted, but Claire had never given much thought to the rumours. That night, she was assigned to the night shift in Ward C, a dimly lit, eerily silent wing of the hospital that had been the setting of countless ghost stories told by her colleagues. As she made her rounds, checking on patients and adjusting their medications, she noticed something unusual. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of a couple walking hand in hand down the corridor. At first, she thought they were visitors who had lost their way, but as she turned to greet them, the couple vanished into thin air. Startled, Claire stood frozen in the corridor, her heart pounding. She had been working at St. Mary's for over 3 years and had never experienced anything like this. She quickly dismissed it as a trick of the light, or her imagination playing tricks on her. But as the night wore on, the image of the couple lingered in her mind. The next morning, Claire mentioned the encounter to one of her colleagues, an older nurse named Jean, who had worked at the hospital for decades. Jean's face turned pale, and she whispered in a low voice, "You've seen them, haven't you? The hand-holding shadows." Claire frowned, confused. "The what?" Jean sighed and leaned in closer. "There's a story that's been passed down through the years. A couple who died in a car accident long ago, right near the hospital, they say. They were brought here, but neither of them survived. Ever since, people have seen them walking the halls, holding hands, as if they are still searching for something, or someone." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to dismiss the story as nothing more than a local legend, but the memory of the couple's ghostly appearance was too vivid to ignore. Chapter 2. The Unraveling Mystery. Over the following weeks, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She began seeing the couple more frequently, always in the same corridor, always walking hand in hand. Their appearances were fleeting, but each time they seemed more real, more tangible. Determined to understand what was happening, Claire began to investigate the history of St. Mary's Hospital. She spent hours in the hospital's archives, poring over old newspapers, medical records, and any documents she could find. It didn't take long for her to uncover the tragic story of Edward and Margaret. Edward and Margaret had been deeply in love, their relationship the talk of the town. They were young, passionate, and seemingly inseparable. But their love story was marred by jealousy and suspicion. Margaret, who had always been prone to insecurity, began to suspect that Edward was seeing someone else. The tension between them grew, leading to frequent arguments. On the night of the accident, they had been driving home from a party. The details were murky, but witnesses reported hearing raised voices and seeing the car swerving erratically before it crashed into a tree near the hospital. Both Edward and Margaret were critically injured and rushed to St. Mary's. Despite the doctor's best efforts, neither survived the night. As Claire delved deeper into the couple's past, she discovered that Margaret's suspicions had been unfounded. Edward had been devoted to her, and the accusations had driven him to despair. But there was more to the story, something darker and more sinister than Claire had anticipated. Chapter 3. The Haunted Past. Claire's research led her to an old, faded letter tucked away in the archives, written by Edward on the night of the crash. It was a love letter to Margaret, filled with regret, sorrow, and a desperate plea for her forgiveness. In it, Edward confessed his love for Margaret and denied the accusations she had made. The letter had never been sent. It had been found in Edward's pocket after the crash. The discovery of the letter added a new layer to the mystery. Why were Edward and Margaret still haunting the hospital? Was it because of the unresolved conflict between them? Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something that hadn't yet been uncovered. Her unease grew as the couple's appearances became more frequent and more disturbing. The once benign figures now looked tormented, their faces twisted in pain and sorrow. Margaret's once beautiful face was marred by the injuries from the crash, and Edward's clothes were stained with blood. Claire began to see them not only in the hospital, but also in her home. They appeared in mirrors, in the shadows, even in her dreams. She could hear their whispers, feel their presence, and sense their desperation. It was as if they were reaching out to her, trying to communicate something urgent and terrifying. As the hauntings intensified, Claire found herself caught in a nightmarish loop. Every night, she relived the couple's final moments, the crash, the screams, the heartbreak. The hospital's corridors became a maze of twisted memories, where reality and the past blurred into one. Chapter 4, The Cursed Promise. One night, as Claire was making her rounds, she found herself once again in the corridor where she had first seen the couple. But this time, something was different. The air was colder, the lights flickered ominously, and the walls seemed to close in around her. As she approached the spot where the couple usually appeared, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The couple materialized before her, their forms more solid and more terrifying than ever. Margaret's eyes were filled with rage, and Edward's face was contorted with sorrow. Suddenly, Claire was no longer in the hospital. She was in the car with them, reliving the crash. The car swerved violently, Margaret's hands gripping the steering wheel with a deathly force. Edward was shouting, trying to calm her, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the engine and the sound of shattering glass. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, Claire realized the truth. Margaret had caused the crash deliberately. In her jealous rage, she had decided that if she couldn't have Edward, no one could. But in her final moments, as the car spun out of control, she had regretted her decision. The crash wasn't just an accident. It was a murder-suicide, driven by a cursed promise that had bound their souls to the hospital. Chapter 5, The Final Confrontation. Armed with the knowledge of the letter and the truth about the crash, Claire decided to confront the spirits. She returned to the hospital late at night, determined to find a way to release Edward and Margaret from their torment. She went to the corridor where they always appeared, holding the letter in her trembling hands. As she read it aloud, the temperature in the room dropped, and the lights flickered wildly. The couple appeared before her, their expressions a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. "Margaret," Claire said, her voice shaking, "Edward loved you. He never betrayed you. Please, let go of your anger. You don't have to relive this nightmare anymore." Margaret's ghostly form wavered, her rage slowly giving way to sorrow. Edward reached out to her, and for a moment, the couple seemed to recognize each other for who they truly were, two souls lost in a tragic misunderstanding. But just as it seemed that peace was within reach, Margaret's face twisted with anger once more. "You don't understand," she hissed. "It's too late. We are bound to this place, bound by our pain, our guilt. We can never leave." As she spoke, the hospital's walls began to close in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Claire felt the cold grip of death surrounding her, pulling her into the same endless loop that had trapped Edward and Margaret. Desperate, Claire made one last attempt to break the curse. She placed the letter on the ground and stepped back, hoping that the words would reach the couple's souls. The paper began to glow with an otherworldly light, and the air filled with the sound of whispers, Edward's final, desperate plea for forgiveness. Margaret's rage faltered, and she turned to Edward, her expression softening. The two ghosts embraced, their forms slowly dissolving into the light. For a brief moment, they were at peace, their souls finally finding the closure they had been denied in life. Epilogue: The Lingering Shadows. Claire stood alone in the corridor, the cold air gradually warming as the light faded. She felt a sense of relief, knowing that Edward and Margaret had finally found peace. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The hospital returned to its usual state, the night shift continuing as if nothing had happened. But Claire knew better. The experience had left her scarred, her nights haunted by the memory of the couple's tragic love story. In the weeks that followed, Claire noticed subtle changes in the hospital. The lights flickered less often, the temperature remained stable, and the eerie sense of being watched gradually faded. But the corridors where Edward and Margaret had walked still felt different, darker, more oppressive. Claire never spoke of the incident to anyone, but she knew that the hospital was still a place where the line between life and death was thin. The spirits of Edward and Margaret might have found peace, but the shadows of St. Mary's would never fully disappear. As the years passed, the story of the hand-holding shadows became just another ghost story whispered among the hospital staff. But Claire knew the truth, that some tragedies never truly end, and some spirits never truly leave. And every now and then, on quiet nights, she would catch a glimpse of a fleeting shadow, a reminder of the love and sorrow that had once haunted the halls of St. Mary's Hospital. The hospital might have moved on, but Claire would never forget the hand-holding shadows, the tragic couple bound by a curse, forever searching for a peace that might never come. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.